We have many things to discuss in regard to India's performance and its outlook. And to continue this discussion, we have our first panel session, which will be chaired by Professor Kettles. Let me ask Professor Kettles and also the panelists to take their places up here on the dais. And Christian, I think I would like to ask you to just introduce the panel. Let's save time this way and get as much time in for different points of view as we can.
Thank you so much. So we're now going to move to a slightly different format. We're not going to have any slides. We're going to have a few statements, but hopefully also a lot of discussion. Indeed, as Richard pointed out, there is a lot on the table to discuss. And I hope we'll actually also come back to the statements that we had just heard in the previous session, maybe towards the end of our discussion. We're a little bit pressed on time. So what I'm not going to do, if you allow me, is I'm not going to introduce you for a long time. Please have a look at the excellent booklet. You'll see the details and the impressive CVs of all our panelists. But I want to move right in. And I want to start with Sanjeev, partly because you actually had the longest trip to get here. You know, not the only Indian on the panel, but the only Indian who has come from India.
No, there's Ramesh Chandi, there are a couple of others.
Well, on this panel.
On this panel, okay.
No, there are many, of course, that have come from India. But Sanjeev, you know, the title of this session is Insights into India's Performance and Outlook. As we discussed, you know, can you give us a little bit of sense on, you know, what's the current economic climate in India? How is the economy going? We've heard in the previous talks a little bit the structural trends, the long-term trends. How is the temperature of the Indian economy right now, and how should we think about that?
So there's no doubt that India's economy is growing very, very fast. Just this morning, the quarterly GDP number for the October to December quarter came out. It's 8.4% year on year. So for the financial year, you're probably now looking at an economy that grew at 7.6, 7.7%. So it's a really rapidly growing economy. By some margin, the fastest growing economy in the world, and growing not only faster than what the IMF had been expected, but even faster than what the government was saying it was growing at. So, you know, a lot of growth momentum. You raised a point, is this inevitable? No. I mean, the fact of the matter is it has to be earned. It has to be earned through continuous reforms, structural, process reforms. I will talk tomorrow about process reforms, an area of reform that is not adequately discussed. But this has to be earned by continuously putting in the effort. But by most indications, within about 18 to 24 months, we will first go past Germany and then Japan and become the world's third largest economy. So we already are the third largest economy in purchasing power terms. This is in US dollar terms. We will become the world's largest economy. Now, of course, we will still be in per capita terms a poor country. And this effort has to be kept going for some 25 odd years. But the point is, for the first time, we are generating serious growth. And we are also now beginning to generate jobs as well. My own sense is that there's no such thing as jobless growth. If you sustain growth over long periods of time, you will generate those jobs, and we are beginning to generate those jobs. You can see that in PLFS and other data. You can clearly see declines in unemployment that is coming through as well. So we are making a dent in that unemployment problem you were talking about. Now, very quickly, there has to be a growth model for this. What's the structure of thinking about policies? And I'm going to talk very quickly about three sort of nodes that we use as part of our thinking about economic policy. The first and most important thing about economic policy that this government believes in is macroeconomic stability. We are macroeconomic conservatives. Even at the height of COVID, we were very restrained in the use of fiscal and monetary policy. That served us well afterwards. But at that point, as you can imagine, we were heavily criticized for this. But if you look at whether it's anchoring inflation through the inflation targeting framework, we have taken a country that used to be historically in the 8 to 12% inflation rate to now in the 2 to 6% range. And we have held it there by and large quite well. Foreign exchange reserves have risen. The banking system has been cleaned up, something I was personally involved in doing, and so on. So from a macroeconomic perspective, this is as stable as you can reasonably expect. Our banks are in very good shape. No, we did not require a very large amount of recapitalization. Some did. But in fact, the insolvency and bankruptcy system has fundamentally changed credit behavior in India. And a lot of money did come back into the banking system. Two, our growth model. We are unapologetic supply-siders. We do not like demand management to generate growth. We are, however, investing heavily in anything that has supply-side implications. Ease of doing business, infrastructure, and now we are also beginning to see a significant acceleration in private investment as well. In fact, the latest data suggests that very clearly. And third anchor of our economic policy is how do we make sure that the bottom of the pyramid gets support? I want to make it very clear, at least I personally am not a socialist. So I have no problem with the billionaires. Everybody complains about billionaires. Look, we are 1/6 of the world's population. We should aspire to have 1/6 of the world's billionaires. The issue is, what do we do for the bottom? That is what matters and what transfers we do. And here we have a framework which we clearly state. It's called Antyodaya, which is the rise of the bottom. And so we're targeting absolute poverty. And we have done everything from direct benefit transfer to the Prime Minister's housing schemes, the Awas Yojana, providing gas to the very poorest, toilet building, all kinds of things. And there is no doubt that that is having a significant dent. You can debate whether the claims of particular ministries are accurate or not, but the dramatic increases in the way life is changing in the bottom is absolutely clear. You just have to go to India and go to the village or go to a slum, and you can clearly see it. Right. So you don't have to be cynical about, so-and-so gave this data, and it's whatever it was before, it has gone completely dramatically improved from whatever it is. So three things: macro stability, supply side, and transfers to the poor. Right. And all three of them have delivered results on the ground. There is no doubt about it.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the changes in the macro environment, the fiscal management that we've seen. But one quick follow-up question. So you talked about the very high growth number at the moment. Now, where I live in Europe, we're complaining about the weak global economy, and that's hurting our export sector, and we're not creating enough growth. Where's the growth coming from in India? What are the sectors? What are kind of the activities that drive this very fast growth that you're reporting at the moment?
So it's certainly the fact that Europe isn't growing, Japan isn't growing, UK is not growing, the US is sort of growing. So the external environment in which we are growing is certainly uncomfortable, and we are not getting very much help from this. So that almost all of this growth is basically domestically driven. Very big source of this is investment. A lot of it is, of course, government infrastructure investment, but by itself that cannot generate growth. So there is now private investment. A lot of it is coming from manufacturing, services. Agriculture in this particular year hasn't been great because we had an El Nino, as you all know, and so rainfall was scattered. So agriculture hasn't been a driving, but if you take a prolonged period of time, as Ramesh Chandji was saying earlier, agriculture too has done decently. I mean, agriculture will never grow at 7-8%. It'll always grow at much lower rates. But nevertheless, in this year, it hasn't been a contributor as well. So it's really domestic investment, a lot of manufacturing, services sector, so construction and stuff like that. So that's where the growth is coming from.
It's interesting because in that sense, you could argue that maybe India is over time becoming more like the US. It's part of the global economy, but a lot of the dynamics are actually domestic. And there are
look, very large economies will be driven to a large extent. Right. Even China, at its height of its boom, was driven heavily by construction. Right. Of course, there was a lot of misallocation for which they're suffering now, but it was driven by a lot of domestic driven construction and stuff like that. And to some extent, that will happen with us as well, because at the stage of development we are, we can build a lot of infrastructure. I mean, we have focused in the last decade or so on intercity infrastructure. The next round that we will now see is intracity infrastructure being built out. And you can already see that in places like Mumbai. You go to Mumbai, go to a tall building, you'll see cranes in every direction. It, in fact, is the world's largest concentration of cranes right now in the world. And the way the city is being reordered is just amazing. I mean, since British times, colonial times, Mumbai functioned on two train lines, basically, and 2 highways. We are adding a absolutely modern, sophisticated metro system. 13 lines are being built at the same time. The longest, the main rib line, line number 3, which will be completed within less than 12 months. That alone, on day 1, will be the world's most heavily used metro line. It's been planned for that. We are building a coastal road in Mumbai, which will again change the dynamics of that city. 12 months maximum. An additional link to the mainland has been created. On the other side of that, we are building a brand new airport. That too, 24 months max, again will be one of the world's largest airports. And this is just one city.
Right. You see that multiplying throughout the country. Sanjeev, thanks so much. So high growth at the moment. You talked about the drivers of that growth. You talked about the structures, macroeconomic stability, supply side, bottom of the pyramid sort of focus. Now you ended up with investment. Investment is clearly needed in India. It has to be financed. So I wanted to turn to Indira and talk to us a little bit about what are the changes that you are seeing on that fiscal side. A lot of changes in the tax regime that we've seen in India. What's the path forward? How is that supporting the growth strategy that we've just heard about from Sanjeev?
Right, thank you. I'll be giving you an insight of the giant strides India has made in its fiscal management side. And very often this is not spoken of. And like you have said that, we all talk about many challenges, climate, we talk about infrastructure and how well, we are coping. But what about the fiscal math? Very often, what is not so well stated is we are able to do this within our budget. Somebody is keeping count, somebody is adding up these numbers, and we are stretching the envelope. So let me tell you how we are doing it is with the aid of technology in particular. So I will talk about it in 2 ways. One is from the tax side. So if you increase your domestic resources, you increase your fiscal envelope, and you can reach your SDG goals that we have set for ourselves. The other side is expenditure. How do you make your expenditure more efficient? How do you make sure your social benefits reach the last mile? And I will give you instances on how we are doing better in all these fronts. So for example, for our taxation side, we have some game-changing reforms, and one is on direct tax front. And I'm only talking about the digital reforms, and there are many other reforms in tax policy and tax rates. But let me give you the digital map, building on your digital infrastructure, India stack. We have the only system in the world called the faceless assessment scheme for direct taxes, where you have no interface between the government and the citizen paying taxes. And that is, we have done away with jurisdiction-based taxation, and you have functional units for taxes. So you have direct taxes, which have now increased phenomenally, and where the scope for issues related to governance and rent seeking have been diminished. That is as far as the direct taxes are concerned. As far as indirect taxes, almost everybody has heard of the one market created by our goods and services tax. The Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, has called it the good and simple tax, in which, in many cases, nobody has ever realized the scale at which this has been conducted. Just think about it. India is the country with 28 different states and 8 union territories. Just the Union Territory of Delhi, which is of 33 million, is greater than the population in Delhi, is greater than the population of the entire country of Australia. So any reform that you talk about has to think about scale. And when you are putting that into a map, we are talking about a goods and services tax. We are integrating 28 countries and maybe 8 more, because each of the union territories are as big as a country. We are integrating 36 countries across an integrated digital map interface. We call this the GSTN. So we have done that, and I could talk more about how we have done this, the process management, the engineering structures that we have gone beyond that. So that has resulted in the last 5 years, the number of taxpayers being registered almost doubling from 7 million to 15 million, and tax collections under indirect taxes, which is almost 50% of our tax collections, increasing double from 7 trillion to about 15 trillion right now. So that is as far as and it is also, one of the places where Mr. Bardhan had referred, we have not done well on cooperative federalism. I may just add that this is one area on cooperative federalism where there has been immense success. There's a Goods and Service, the GST Council, which has had over 15 meetings, and there have been 15 taxes which have been sort of integrated into a single tax.
Can I just ask you, so you said 15 million taxpayers?
Registered taxpayers are indirect.
So these are companies. These are not.
These are companies, and also these are proprietorships, and any registered taxpayers where you have to take in, you're buying and selling goods.
I'm just asking because 15 million is a large number.
Yes.
But as you said, India is a huge economy. What share sort of economic activity is covered by these?
Again, we are moving forward to making it better. So we started with a base of 7 million in 2019, and now we are 15 million. So in leaps and bounds, that's a CAGR of 14%. So where we are going, we're going very fast. So this entire reform process is generating linkages and externalities of building businesses and sort of integrating it in a way that we are moving forward and everybody's in the value chain. So, tax doesn't cascade, costs are coming down, productivity is increasing, and it is a process. And this process, which we don't talk about much, is moving it forward. What you will see, the gains just multiplying. So this is as far as our fiscal front is going. Very interestingly, what is not, again, spoken much about, what is being done on the expenditure front, right? We spend public spending as a proportion of GDP is almost 30%. Translated, it means almost 47,000 rupees per person, or almost 1/5 of per capita income is public spending. How do we track it? Who gets this money? Can we add up how many canals are being built in India? So this is a historical issue. It has nothing to do, if you look at the way accounts are being kept and you see the bookkeeping, it starts with when the Constitution was set up in 75 years ago, and where you have different bookkeeping standards and different, we have different state structures, it's a very complex system. You have a central government, you have a state government, you have local governments, everybody with different bookkeeping, everybody with different schemes and money floating. I have done intensive research. I've actually taken the 1 rupee which flows from the central government and tracked it to the beneficiary and spoken to the beneficiary across 4 states in India. And these are some of the research findings that I find. And I will talk about 4 leading innovations in terms, very briefly, and very happy to talk about it later, which have increased public spending efficiency. One is just-in-time funding. The second is, a single source of truth that we have for social entitlement schemes. And the third, end-to-end data capture. All of these have increased the way we spend. Let me give you an example. When the central, we have been told, there are many central government schemes, and when they're called a centrally sponsored scheme, the money flows from the central government, from the center to the state, and through the implementing agencies, and to the last mile, it goes through a chain of systems. Very often, it's very difficult to connect the dots. And it has nothing to do, it is the way systems have been have come across over generations. What has now happened is for centrally sponsored schemes, there's something called a single nodal account. And this was started in 2019. If you look, the moment the money is released by the central government, it goes to the state treasury, it goes to the implementing agencies. Money earlier was parked. You send the money from the central government, it's parked somewhere. And it's parked in a government account, or it's called the public ledger, or wherever. It's called parking of funds, floating of funds, or whatever you call it, without too much accountability. Now money is released just in time. When you spend it, the system, the digital map, it goes through the system. It's called a single nodal account for centrally sponsored schemes. So central government is spending its money more efficiently. What's happening at the state government? I will just give you 3 instances of how money is being spent more efficiently. You will be very happy to know the state of Karnataka has a scheme called the Kutumba scheme. Now, the Kutumba scheme has integrated 15 million households, or in terms of in terms of number of people, it's about 60 million people through an integrated platform. It is, India is complex. Let's think about it. I, as a beneficiary, I can get money for building my house. I can get money for my education. I can get money, for a toilet. I can get money, for my health scheme. I can get money, So this Kutumba scheme, what it has done in Karnataka, has integrated 15 different databases, including birth and death, etc., farmers' income. So if you do Kutumba, there's a girl somewhere in some village, nobody knows who it is. Her family earns X amount, which is very low, and she's entitled to an education grant. Bam, the government announces it, and it's in her bank account. Then very next day. These are the unsung stories of India, which is moving forward. So that is how we've integrated the social registries and entitlement schemes.
So the changes that you're describing is not something that you just see at the central level of the government,
the state
but you see that throughout different parts of government. Is there a lot of heterogeneity, or you really see that all of these states are capable and willing to kind of drive this agenda forward?
No, that's where I think you're absolutely right. There are these stories, and the part of the story is there's so many different places and touch points where you can do change management, and there's so many good stories for every state at different touch points, that there is a lot of heterogeneity, and there is the time for it to move forward. So I'll stop here. Happy to talk more about how things are moving. Yes, but there is a move towards definitely increasing the fiscal envelope by using digital means, whether it's taxes or whether it's expenditure. And this is, the accounting, bookkeeping, which is not very interesting. There's untold stories of, how do I balance my books of accounts?
It becomes interesting and scary if it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So, I think what we heard from both Sanjeev and Indira was sort of one piece of the growth story is certainly connected with the macroeconomic side and much more efficient fiscal policy. Interesting to see that the changes are both on the revenue generating side with the tax reforms, but also on the spending side with better tracking. Now with our other 2 panelists, Nirvika and Kevin, I want to go a little bit on maybe what you would call the supply side. Some of those issues that are about how do we change the structure of the economy and address some of the challenges that have already come up in the earlier discussions. Nirvika, green transformation is one of these big topics that not only face India, but also India. Where does the country stand? What are you seeing as some of the key issues?
If I can just take an extra minute in the beginning to just frame this idea of a green transition. So if we think about India's growth strategy or any country's growth strategy, we're talking about increasing output. And looking at it in the abstract, there are 5 inputs, labor and capital, the usual ones, then also knowledge, energy, and raw materials. Now, if we think about where India is now, even if it's growing at 6-7%, it will take 2 or 3 decades to reach where China is now. So I think India has to not only maintain its growth, but possibly accelerate its growth. One of the slides that Christian showed, was something by Danny Roderick, which talked about premature deindustrialization and how India's in some sense missed the boat. But what I'm going to present argues that actually there's more than one new boat sailing. So if we think about accelerating the growth rate, one of the barriers right now, and it will come into my structural argument, is that savings rates are still not quite high enough. And this has some roots in inefficiencies in India's financial intermediation system. But if we think about how we're going to grow, how India is going to grow, it's really going to be a new kind of growth. And there are two forces that you all recognize that are going to drive this very different kind of growth. One is the increased importance of information technology, particularly AI, which means lots of different things. Not just generative AI, but also just plain vanilla AI, which makes efficient choices and so on. And the other, of course, is climate change. And I think dealing with these two forces in some sense has to be the foundation of India's growth strategy. If you think about India's position now, it is actually well placed because it has been a late grower, and it has the opportunity to create a completely new infrastructure and economic structure based on renewable energy. And that's, of course, the key input in all of this that connects with climate change, is that we are seeing this massive shift from fossil fuels, which fueled the Industrial Revolution and our growth for 200 years, to something very, very different, renewable energy. Now, if you think about what has to be done there, it involves, of course, solar power generation. If you do the numbers, the numbers are actually not, surprisingly, not astronomical. If India's solar power capacity grows at 10% a year for several decades, it will achieve good targets in terms of getting to net zero, for example, by 2050 or 60 or 70. The other point I want to make is that this green transition is not only technically feasible, but it is also feasible in terms of cost. Solar power with appropriate investments in storage, for example, is competitive with coal. You can see how the government of India is quickly adapting. It put on, in the national electricity policy, put on hold plans to build new coal-fired power plants, and instead said we're going to invest that money in developing battery storage technology, which is absolutely what India needs. India has the opportunity to really create a completely new economy based on renewable energy, and that's what I call a green transition. Where does the other big driving force, information technology, come in? Everything we're doing now in terms of products and services, well, products in particular, but also services like electricity supply and generation, when we have a new grid that is based on renewable energy, there's going to be a much greater need for software to manage that, not only because the grid will be more complex, but also the value of energy efficiency is going to go up. So you can see how sometimes there are we're worried about AI taking away jobs, but sometimes AI can also lay the foundations for creating jobs. A lot of this new infrastructure will create new manufacturing jobs and new service jobs. And here, India has to be, I think, aggressive. Just because China dominates the production of solar panels and is now starting to dominate the production of electric vehicles, does not mean that there's no room for India in those markets, because again, we're looking at a global transformation. And if you look at compound growth, the growth opportunities for India in this global green transition are just enormous.
But Nivika, can I
Yes.
jump in there? So I understand the opportunity also
Yes.
to combining green and digital.
Yes.
Where India has clear asset. But I wanted to double down a little bit on that China point, because we all need solar panels and so on as
Yes.
consumers. As producers, the reality is, the Chinese have more than 80% of the production. Their cost levels are much lower than what we
Yes.
see in other countries. Where does India stand? I mean, what's the sort of strategy to catch up and ultimately achieve cost levels that are comparable to the Chinese producers?
I think that's something where Sanjeev will have more insight into, where India is in terms of implementation. I mean, looking at it as an outsider, for example, I feel like India is being a little slow in terms of, developing the transition to producing electric vehicles. With China, you can see, just in the last 10, 15 years, they've become a major global supplier of electric vehicles. And I think India needs to accelerate that. Things like, the previous speaker mentioned, electric buses. So often, corporate fleets, public transportation, all of these, once you start to electrify these, then you can have, more infrastructure, and then you get faster adoption. And I honestly, I'm an economist, but I also recognize that there are market failures. And there's a lot of, I think, scope for industrial policy here in terms of providing, incentives or subsidies or whatever you want to call them to Indian firms, which I think the Indian government can be more. I mean, it is also already doing some of these things. I think also openness is very important. Openness to new technologies, innovation. A lot of innovation is driven by free flow of ideas. So.
Thank you so much. I think there's really a growth driver here with the green transition, interesting assets in India with IT. I hope we have another point in the panel, not in the panel, but in the program of these 2 days to actually get back to that discussion. Also as a European, because we face the same problem. We want to make the quick transition, but how do we ensure that we actually build competitive industries in these areas as well, which clearly is the big growth opportunity.
Yes.
I want to turn to Kevin. One of the key drivers that we know globally of innovation and creativity is cities. We already heard the immense size of Indian cities, the investments that are happening in infrastructure, like in Mumbai. You've worked with many cities around the world, and what their agendas are to drive creativity, innovation, and productivity. Where does India stand at the moment, and how is your kind of outlook for the urban centers in India moving forward?
Yeah. So I keep trying to figure out how to best start this, and there's no good answer.
Just start.
I know. Well, no, the one thing I will say, I do want to say, Amit started this morning by kind of paraphrasing, Amartya Sen and saying you can say whatever you want about India and the exact opposite, and both will be true. And I think we've heard examples of that already this morning, but I actually think the urbanization and what's been happening with urbanization in India, the way people are moving to cities, I think is a good example of that. If you look at, as everybody else does, right, India versus China, right now, the population of China, over 2/3 of the population is living in an urbanized area. In India, it's just over 1/3. In the past 10 years, the rate of which urbanization has increased in China has gone up on average 1% per year over the past 10 years. It's gone up under 0.5% per year in India. So urbanization is not only well behind, but in fact, it's still moving at a slower pace. It's even getting further behind, if you will, as it continues. Now, I don't think this is all bad, and I don't think this is a bad news story. I actually think it's actually kind of good news. We have talked about this. I always call it the Jugaad urbanization of India, using a word that I see Indians smile as soon as I say Jugaads, right? Everybody else is like, what the hell? And we're on Stanford, actually, and they actually have a whole center devoted to Jugaad innovation here. But the idea of a Jugaad is what my dad used to always call close enough for government work. it works. It might not be the best, but it works, right? And if you really look at urbanization across India and how urbanization has been happening, it works. It's not really speedy. It's not really, right? But I think it's intentional. I actually do think that because one of the things, while increased urbanization leads to greater economic outcome in general, and especially in the developed world, absolutely. But in the developing world, it's a bigger challenge because if cities grow too fast, too quickly, all it does is kind of multiply the number of slums. And if the infrastructure can't keep up with the growth, then everything starts to fall apart. So you see this in cities around the world, huge agglomerations of people where there really isn't, the bottom of the pyramid has not been lifted. You don't have, in fact, you keep increasing the size. The base keeps getting bigger and bigger because people are leaving the countryside and moving to cities, and then you even end up, the agricultural points are absolutely wonderful, right? Because it's that part of why you still want to support and maintain it, because if everybody moves to the city, then who's feeding them? Right? You end up with these problems where you've got large cities and no one in the countryside growing food for them anymore. And so I do think that if you look at urbanization across India, and it has been very much, even recently, it's been, as you said, the intercity kinds of infrastructure investments, great for moving goods around, somewhat for moving people around, but mainly focused on moving goods around. But not a lot of intra-city stuff. Again, not increasing the opportunities to encourage a lot more people to move to cities. And so I do think that going forward, right, that definitely there's huge opportunities in this to get back to the points on green and digital and the other things that are happening and the innovations and all those things that are going on. As somebody who lives in Toronto, and Sanjeev, I'm going to argue with you about cranes later, because we will absolutely tell you we have more than anybody else in the world. Once Dubai fell apart, we took over. But that kind of infrastructure and the housing and all the other things that you have to create for that create tremendous opportunity and create a lot of, on the supply side, as you said, right, a lot of built-in demand and ability to do things, a lot of construction jobs, which can be lower skill, great for labor, all kinds of other things, right? So I do think there's tremendous opportunity there. But if you really look at the history and what's been going on and what's been happening, it is almost like the brakes have been put on, right? It's like, yeah, we don't want everybody moving. Plenty of people still move to the cities. It's enough, but I think there's plenty of opportunity there going forward. But there's a lot of room for that to still happen.
So Kevin, listening to you, and it sounds to me like what you're describing is sort of a second best scenario. So the institutional structures don't quite allow urban center to really grow, and so the way that they grow slower in India is a good thing, but it's a response to something that you now described as the brakes. What would need to happen to remove those brakes, assuming that would be a good thing to drive stronger long-term growth in the economy?
Well, which I do, right? I do actually think you're right. Urbanization is a huge boon, and I think that part of it really is trying to get to the point where you can increase the infrastructure. Because again, what happens is if you build cities without increasing the infrastructure around them, and I don't just mean the roads and subways, it's also hospitals and schools and shopping centers and markets and all the things that really make a city work. And the inclusion and diversity of the people who are living there, right, and getting them involved and engaged in everything that's going on. You have to do all of that, right? You need it, and if you don't do that, then all you do is increase concentrations of poverty. So I do think that it still is. There's it's always the chicken and egg issue always, right? It's like, well, and so you need to do both at the same time, in that you need to be improving the infrastructure, improving what's there, making housing and housing opportunities, and getting away from informal housing, right? What's just a slum. And even the informal economy, right? All the stuff that's relying on the informal economy, you just don't know what's going on there. Nobody pays taxes on informal economy stuff, right? So finding ways to structure and organize some of that stuff to be able to support more of that, while at the same time, I think, recognizing the supports for the people in the countryside, if you will, for agriculture and stuff that way.
Thank you so much. So we've heard sort of, if you will, for vignettes or stories about India. And as you said, all of these stories, even if they both where they align or where they tell different stories, represent the country. High growth at the moment, sort of a very clear idea what the long-term growth story is. Fiscal management on both the expenditure and the revenue side changing. Opportunities through the green transformation and IT. Opportunities to do more in unlocking the potential of urban centers. I wanted to do one final round, also a bit in reflection of the last presentation that we heard. Overall, this is a story of high growth and potential. So I wanted to get, starting from Nirvikas and moving along here, a quick reaction. So is India's challenge moving forward basically on executing the path that you're on? Or do you see one big thing in your area where you think, no, here we really need to still change course in order to be successful? Nirvikas.
So I would say on the whole that I think India's economic strategy makes sense. I think in some cases there could be more of an emphasis in terms of accelerating things. And then that has implications for implementation. But in India, and I think this is true for any developing economy, well, not entirely true. Sometimes, economic strategists use models which turn out to be bad models. But I think in this case, I think the economic direction for India is very clear, and it's,
so the course is right, but now it's about getting it done and being efficient.
And implementation is particularly challenging for India because it is large, heterogeneous, and you have to coordinate different levels. And in some sense, I think that has always been the biggest challenge for India, and it also creates tensions on the political side, which.
Sanjeev, do you concur, or do you see there's a major thing in the road that we really need to be careful about where we...
So you see, when the economy is clearly growing and there's so much momentum, everybody will go and say, oh, democracy must be flawed in some way or something like that. So because that can't really be proved, you see. And so they will be saying, oh my God, there are investigations into opposition leaders. And I think that's a description of American politics. I had no idea that Professor Bardhan was a closet Trumpian. So the point here is, you see, rapid growth and transformation doesn't make everybody happy. There are members of the old elite in India who are quite unhappy about it. There are some academics based in Western universities that are very unhappy about it. In the old days, they used to come to India for the winter and make presentations at the India Habitat Center. Now nobody turns up for their presentations, so they are a little disgruntled, let's say. But let's look at the facts. Many of the things he quoted were basically these indices and rankings from various of these international think tanks. And India always does very badly in those. We've got to take these things with a pinch of salt. For example, there is always something called the Variety of Democracy Index, which ranks democracies around the world. And India always does badly in it. Okay, we may call ourselves the world's largest democracy, but we'll be number 95 or 100 or something like that. Now, okay, maybe we are a flawed democracy, but let's look at who are the great democracies in that list. Kingdom of Denmark, Kingdom of Sweden, Kingdom of Norway, Kingdom of Belgium, United Kingdom, Commonwealth of Australia. And basically, the main point is being a kingdom is good for democracy. So these kinds of indices are just created, almost all of them, in a tiny number of think tanks based in the North Atlantic countries, which are now being used in a neo-colonial kind of way to manage narratives. I did a research, which I published, on who are the people who fund these think tanks. They're funded by 4 institutions, 4 sources of funding, and I'll also tell you who they are. One of them is Open Society, Soros, Omidyar, Rockefeller, and Ford. So all these think tanks, maybe dozens of them, they're funded by the same 4 organizations.
I see we need to start a new panel for this discussion, and maybe, Amit, you need to...
No, you had 20 minutes. I just got 3.
No, so maybe Amit and Richard should think about whether we can get the two of you to discuss, but not now.
Yeah.
Because we don't have that much time left on our panel, and I think then, of course, we need to go to a break. So let me move over. So again, is India on a path that goes in the right direction but needs to be managed? Or are there kind of kinks in the road that you're worried about or that you think need to require a course correction?
You can't argue with the big numbers of macro. We are the fastest growing economy. We are the trend among the emerging markets. We are still the fastest consecutively. And I'm very, very optimistic on this growth story. And I am the budget keeper, right? I see, can this growth story, is it sustainable? Can we do our fiscal math? Or do we have an unlimited, spend criteria? And I'm optimistic that with the sort of initiatives we are taking in improving our fiscal envelope on both the revenue side and the expenditure side, that as we move along in the growth story, we will be able to fund that, and we will be able to reach or at least move further towards the sustainable good development goals that we are trying to achieve. Because we are looking at some things like basic accounting and bookkeeping while we are doing it.
I'm getting harsh signals from Amit that we need to close. My apologies, Kevin. I want to thank all the panelists. The idea was not to kind of have one story out of 4 or 5 mouths, but to give you different facets on where India stands. You get to ask questions, but around the tea and coffee tables that will follow now. So the discussion is not over. I understand it has only started. Do that with a little bit of drink, and then we are going to get back in, I guess, 10 minutes or so afterwards. Thank you again, and share me in a round of applause to the panelists.